10 a.m. on the West Coast, 1 p.m. on the East Coast. You're live with the guy. Today we got a casual Monday. We're going to go first into a story of Tim Walz. He actually does a hardball interview with a journalist that wants to do their job. It's the first time I've seen him or Kamala Harris with some real pushback like Donald Trump gets in almost every interview. Next, we're going to go into the president of the Heritage Foundation. He absolutely goes scorched earth on the World Economic Forum at a World Economic Forum event. It was absolutely lovely to see. And finally, and what the thumbnail of this video was Robert Barnes. If you don't know who Robert Barnes is, I'm kind of using the speech he gives as a segue to introduce the public to who Robert Barnes is. He's one of the best constitutional attorneys alive today, as well as he has really formed the four fundamental pillars of what populism is. Okay, first let's go into the Tim Walz interview.
On the back end.
I want to clarify what the law is there in Minnesota. Abortion Finder, a website that helps women find access, says abortion is legal throughout pregnancy in Minnesota. There is no ban or limit on abortion in Minnesota based on how far along in a pregnancy you are. You signed the bill that makes it legal through all 9 months. Is that a position you think Democrats should advocate for nationally?
Look, the vice president and I have been clear. The restoration of Roe versus Wade is what we're asking for.
But that law goes far beyond Roe v. Wade.
To make her own choice. The law is very clear. It does not change that. That was been debunked on every occasion.
But wait, let's agree. What you signed is there's not a single limit through 9 months of pregnancy. Roe had a trimester framework that did have limits through the pregnancy. The Minnesota law does not have that.
This puts the decision with the woman and her health care providers. The situation we have is when you don't have the ability of health care providers to provide that, that's where you end up with a situation like Amanda Zaworski in Texas, where they are afraid to do what's necessary. This doesn't change anything. It puts the decision back on to the woman, to the physicians, and we know that this is simply something to be brought up to be very clear. Donald Trump's asking for a nationwide abortion ban. And again, we don't see this.
It was good to see the reporter giving a lot of pushback on this. And it's Tim Walz's classic thing where he says, no, we're talking about this, and not actually answering the question or admitting what's actually in the bill. Again, with the abortion pill and the person that supposedly died when they had to go out of state, the journalist is going to correct him on that in a little bit. And it's good to see that he's getting fact checked in live time, and he doesn't know what to do other than stick with the lie. And eventually it all comes out. So let's continue.
He said repeatedly that he will not sign a national abortion ban. Are you calling that just, it's a flat out lie?
Yes, of course. And Senator Vance has in the past said so too. Now look, they may see this as an election issue. We see it as a right of women to make their own bodily decisions. And that's what the states like my state have the ability to put that in. States like Georgia force women to cross the border, and then we have a death of Amber Thurman. So let's be very clear. Trying to cut hairs on an issue on this is not where the American public's at. They want the restoration of Roe versus Wade. Vice President Harris said she would sign it. That's what we'll do when we're elected.
But to be clear, the Minnesota law is far beyond Roe v. Wade. And about the Amber Thurman case in Georgia, her family has, and it's tragic, she is a young mother who left behind a young son. But what her family has said is it was a complication from an abortion pill that she received, and she didn't get proper care when she went to a Georgia hospital, which had multiple opportunities to intervene there. Her own attorney, the family's attorney, says it wasn't the Georgia law, it was the hospitals. What he claims is malpractice, not treating her when she clearly showed up in distress and still had the byproducts of her pregnancy because of that rare complication from the abortion pill. So just to be clear on the Georgia law and how her family and her attorney sees it. Republicans came out against it long before President Trump indicated he didn't like it either. Listen, before we go, because I wish that we had a full hour, I want to give you a chance because you called yourself a knucklehead this week.
It was really, really good to finally see Tim Walz have to answer a question and him getting a reality check. I wish this would happen more, and I will credit Tim Walz. He didn't look good in this interview, but at least he did an interview where he got some pushback and there was some back and forth, because nobody likes to see a kindergartner interview where it's just like a bunch of fanfare from a journalist happy to be in the room with Tim Walz. Or come, let's finish off the interview here.
to talk about some of your misstatements. Yes. You've modified your story or explained that you misspoke about things involving your military rank, about carrying a weapon in war, your 1995 DUI arrest, using IVF to have your beautiful children, Gus and Hope, being in Hong Kong and China in the summer of 1989 during the Tiananmen events. A lot of people would say they couldn't get away with saying, I'm just too passionate, my grammar's not right, I'm a knucklehead. What do you say to the American people who think, I don't know that I can trust this guy with all those modifications to be the potential commander-in-chief of this country?
Yeah, well, I think they heard me. They heard me the other night speaking passionately about gun violence and
they heard you lie.
And I got to be honest with you, Shannon. I don't think people care whether I used IUI or IVF when we talk about this. What they understand is Donald Trump would resist those things. Look, I speak passionately.
False.
I had an entire career, decades before I was in public office.
I can't let that slide. He's saying that he's for IVF and Donald Trump's not for IVF. That's a complete fabrication. Donald Trump is the most pro-IVF candidate there is. He's actually come out and said he wants public health care to pay for it, which is even a step further than Kamala Harris or Tim Walz want to go. They don't understand how to fight back against Donald Trump's abortion policies and IVF policies because he's an extreme moderate. He wants to let the states decide. He doesn't want to take women's rights. And he's also very pro-IVF, which the traditional Republican Party isn't. So when they made their talking points, they thought they were going to go against the traditional Republican Party from the 90s, which was the pro-war party and the anti-health party. The new Donald Trump MAGA populist movement is completely different. This is the Maha movement, and they're pro-women's rights and pro-health. Okay, let's continue.
They know, and I'm very proud of my 24 years in service and my record. I have never disparaged someone else in this, but I know that's not what Donald Trump does. They disparage everyone, the personal attacks. I will own up when I misspeak. I will own up when I make a mistake. Let's be very clear. The vice president has made it clear that she has policies that make a difference. Her border policies are the most strongest, the fairest we've seen.
But now, Governor, you know a lot of people, including your own party, would not join that statement. There are millions of people who have come here over the last few years that, you know, they see this as an open border.
Well, simply, we have a policy. Donald Trump sees it as a political. Look, James Langford in Oklahoma, the Border Patrol agents, the Wall Street Journal, the Chamber of Commerce, all said pass this legislation. You have to have Congress to authorize 1,500 new border agents. You have to have Congress to authorize DOJ to speed adjudications on these asylum claims. Those are things that would actually work.
Okay, this is absolutely insane. He's saying that he has the strong border policy, and the only reason the border policy isn't working is because the Republicans wouldn't pass the bill. First of all, Donald Trump wasn't in office, so for him to have the political power to stop a bill, I don't see it. But that number two is that particular bill actually allowed up to 5,000 immigrants a day to come in, and that's illegal immigrants a day to come in, and up to 8,000. Once they reach the mark of 8,000, then they would have to forcefully stop them. But having 8,000 people a day illegally enter into the country, that adds up to hundreds of thousands, if not millions a year. It's not a good border policy, and there's a reason they went against it. They didn't want to legalize illegal immigration, and that's why the Republicans stood against it. Okay, hopefully it's almost done, I believe.
Donald Trump told us for 4 years he would deal with this. He didn't. He didn't build his wall, 2%. Mexico didn't pay for it. This is a real bill that has bipartisan support. It has the experts on board, and it starts to tackle these issues. And we don't have to resort to demonizing people. We don't have to resort to making up or crafting stories, as Senator Vance said he did. Those things were not happening in Springfield, but it doesn't mean that we can't pass a piece of legislation to strengthen our border. That's what Kamala Harris is talking about.
Well,
She's talking
Governor,
about solving the problem.
That piece of legislation does include the wall that you guys have been so, you've disparaged that. I mean, the vice president has as well, so I don't know if she really intends to move forward with that. But it was negotiated by 3 or 4 senators, and many Republicans came out against it long before President Trump indicated he didn't like it either.
Shannon Bream cooked.
Okay, that's good. So she called him out on the border wall as well, and it's crazy how Kamala Harris said building a wall was racist. That's what they said over and over and over. And then they said they would undo the Remain in Mexico policy and all the other executive orders Donald Trump had put in place, which actually prevented mass illegal immigration. So the fact that Kamala Harris is now going down to the border and having a photo opportunity at the wall itself, which he was so much against, is just completely hypocritical in its very nature. Okay, let's go into the next one. I found this clip very interesting. It was a speech by the Heritage Foundation president at a World Economic Forum event, being interviewed by somebody from the World Economic Forum, and absolutely going scorched earth on the World Economic Forum itself.
One thing that Davos, you might say, and the people come here stand up for, is liberal democracy.
It's laughable that you would, or anyone would, describe Davos as protecting liberal democracy. I'll be candid here because I think I've been invited here to be candid. Elites tell us that open borders and even illegal immigration are okay. The average person tells us in the United States that both rob them of the American way of life. Elites also tell us that public safety isn't a problem in big American cities. Just travel to New York or Washington or Dallas, Texas. The average person will tell you that the lack of public safety damages not just the American way of life, but their life. Elites tell us that we have this existential crisis with so-called climate change. The solutions, the average person know, cost more human lives, especially in Europe during the time that you need heating, than do the problem and the problems themselves. The fourth, China. The number one adversary, not just to the United States, but to free people on planet Earth. Not only do we at Davos not say that, we give the Chinese Communist Party a platform. And fifth, as we sit here.
I really like how he put that in, because whether you're against China or not, you do have to admit their policies on freedom and how they treat their own population is, I don't think the best way to treat a population, and not how a civilization should be treated. Now, their civilization is rising, and if they win the economic battle between them and the U.S., their policies are going to be adopted by many other countries. So it's very important in this economic battle that freedom does win, and populist policies such as food freedom, medical freedom, political freedom, and financial freedom win out. Because right now, the Chinese government has complete control in those areas over their population. Okay, let's continue.
Another supranational organization, the World Health Organization, is discussing foisting gender ideology upon the global South. These are practices that are under review, if not being rejected, by countries in Northern Europe. The new president, especially if it's President Trump, will, as you like to say, trust the science. He will understand the basic biological reality of manhood and womanhood. And do you know why? Not because of retribution, not because he's a dictator, but because he has the power of the American people behind him. Let me just correct the slight assertion you made there. We want Ukraine to win. We want to see Ukraine win with a lot more help from European allies. I think the United States has a role. Heritage has been clear about this for 2 years now, that there is a world in which we support military aid for Ukraine. Our first obligation in foreign policy is to look at it through the lens of what's best for the American citizen. Joe Biden has done a god-awful job in articulating what that is. The kind of person who will come into the next conservative administration is going to be governed by one principle, and that is destroying the grasp that political elites and unelected technocrats have over the average person. And if I may, I will be candid and say that the agenda that every single member of the administration needs to have is to compile a list of everything that's ever been proposed at the World Economic Forum and object all of them wholesale.
Okay, that was a great speech, and I say that's a great speech, not agreeing with everything that was in the speech. I don't agree with continuing funding in Ukraine, even if they fund the problems of the United States nationally. Also, we were talking a lot about immigration, and immigration is just not a concern just for the U.S., but a lot of people in Mexico seem to think it is. If Donald Trump reverses these policies and deports millions and millions of immigrants out forcefully, and let's just have a hypothetical situation that he dumps millions of illegal immigrants in Mexico, the Mexican people are going to have a huge problem with immigration. Right now, they don't have a problem with it because these immigrants are just passing through Mexico, going up to the United States, and ultimately destroying the United States economy from the inside out. The United States allows more immigrants than any other country, but they want to do so legally so they can best financially support not only the legal immigrants, but the population and citizens of the United States itself. Okay. The last clip I'm going to have is more of a speech. It's not time sensitive. This is about from 10 months ago. I'm using it as a segue to kind of introduce people that may not know who Robert Barnes is into showing you who he is. He's somebody, he's probably the only content creator I watch 3 to 4 times a week. Every time he posts, I'm watching it. And if I miss it, I go back and I watch it. You can find him on Viva Barnes Locals. How do you say it there, Nat? vivabarneslaw.locals.com. I always get tongue twisted when I say that. Okay, I'm going to try to play this in full, but I don't want to get copyrighted, so I may stop it once or twice. Let's go with the clip, though. Wait, 1 second before we go. This is the gentleman. He runs 1776 Law in the United States. It's a constitutional law firm. They do take a lot of constitutional cases that would not be cost effective to actually try, but they do it on a basis where they'll take the case at no cost so they can set a precedent very often. So then other lawyers and other people can come in through there with the precedents that were set, whether it's vaccine mandates, whether it's food freedom, things like this. And the 4 pillars of populism are constantly put forth by Robert Barnes himself, which is food freedom, financial freedom, political freedom, and let's play the clip.
Where did the FBI go awry? It is a bit of a trick question because there is an answer, and the answer, as is often the case, is in the Constitution. There is no place for a federal police force in the United States Constitution. Our founders probably understood that the direction that it would take if we did do so. It's also why there's no standing army. Let's just look at some recent examples before we go back and look at the history of the FBI and ways in which it has always been problematized by its politicized character. Though the nature of it has expanded and extended and has gone to a scale and a scope we have never witnessed before, beginning with the election or just the campaign of President Trump. Take, for example, the January 6th Proud Boys trial taking place currently in the District of Columbia. In that case, there has been multiple documentation of the role of informants, infiltrators, and instigators in the events of January 6th.
Major problem in the United States right now.
I was there on January 6th. I decided not to take the unauthorized tour of the Capitol. I was instead sitting in the offices of some Trump cabinet officials as we ultimately watched it unfold. I was there at the behest of President Trump after representing him in Georgia and challenging what was taking place in the election. I would note that President Trump only filed one election contest himself that he was able to legally, and that took place in Georgia. Of note, the court somehow, even though the court was required to conduct a hearing within 5 days of its filing, on January 6th, the Georgia courts had still just not got around, weeks after its filing, to ever hearing the case. Indeed, they wouldn't decide to hear it until after January 6th came and went. In fact, there was never an evidentiary hearing on the election contest President Trump filed in Georgia. It was amidst that frustration and agitation that people gathered that day on January 6th to hear the president speak.
Very often we'll hear about the 60 times Donald Trump tried to go into court, and each time it was knocked down. It was knocked down. The truth was there was only one, and the court itself broke its own laws and refused to hear the case in a timely fashion. They never heard it. All those other 60 cases were not brought by Donald Trump. They were brought by other lawyers, other peoples, and private citizens. Okay, let's continue.
And as the president asked them to do, to peacefully protest outside the Capitol to make sure that our Constitution's framework for adjudicating election disputes and controversies, which, by the way, despite what Vice President Mike Pence would have some people believe, both Vice President John Adams and Vice President Thomas Jefferson had exercised their constitutional authority to decide electoral contests going back to the very founding of our country. And then people got wind as they were outside the Capitol that was not going to occur. Pence made the peculiar decision to wait to release his decision until right at the beginning of that presentation, which helped put certain things into motion. but things were already in motion. There was an unusual lack of law enforcement present that day. The Capitol is the most secure building in the world, particularly on January 6th. There are over 2,500 people that are just police officers of the Capitol. Once again, we may be seeing part of our problem. Why does the Capitol even have a police? If they had had regular local police, there's the issue of District of Columbia having its own control, and that being a separate and secondary question. But if it had had regular police not under political control, maybe they would have been properly present that day and there never would have been any issues. Because what happened was there was an unusual lack of security in some parts of the Capitol, number one. Number two, there were other members of the police that were actually guiding protesters into a compressed area where they would then be attacked by members of the Capitol Police, that would lead to people reacting and responding, and only the people that reacted and responded were caught on camera, broadcast to the world, or ultimately prosecuted. The Capitol Police who initiated...
This was an issue we had with Ray Epps. Ray Epps was one of the main contributors to January 6th on telling people go into the Capitol. He was directly doing everything and he should have been prosecuted. The fact that he wasn't prosecuted put a target on his back and made him look like a government official itself. Still to this day, there's a lot of questions that haven't been answered. And secondly, when it comes to the standing army, Donald Trump did ask for 10,000 National Guard to be placed there. And as we've seen on video from Nancy Pelosi's own daughter's video, Nancy Pelosi rejected the idea of having any National Guard there. Nancy Pelosi was the one that had the final say, and she denied the fact that any National Guard would be there. Let's continue.
And instigated that conflict, took a complete walk from any accountability and responsibility. Then you had other Capitol Police that were escorting people into the building that day, while other Capitol Police were attacking them in other parts of the building. So, you know, if you had just stumbled into it, you didn't know what was happening. It was still one of the most unusual Capitol riots in American history, and there have been plenty of Capitol riots through our history, through the history around the world. You can watch the protests currently taking place in France to see what real riots look like. They usually involve, you know, either farmers.
Okay, I was watching the Tim Walz, J.D. Vance debate the other day, and Tim Walz brought up that 17 police officers died. That was completely false. Not a single police officer died the day of January 6th. Zero. And this is propaganda they keep trying to use to dramatize January 6th like it was the extremely violent event. There was some violence, but nobody died. And one more thing I would like to say about this was the only person that did die was Ashley Babbitt herself, and this was a protester. She was an unarmed protester. Now, whether she was going to get into a restricted area and her death was justified or not, she was the only one that died that day. There was not 17 police officers, and I don't know how Tim Walz said the number 17, because I've heard Democrats in the past try to claim that 3 police officers died that day, which ended up being completely false. The fact that they're at 17 right now shows they are absolutely desperate and behind in these polls, and they're trying to make small lies into massive lies. Okay, let's continue with this.
Being food or manure, depending on their choice that day on the public streets, or people raiding into buildings or protesting BLM style, as took place in the summer of 2020, just a few months before those protests. While the people that did those BLM protests, including threatening to burn down St. John's, the great historic church across from the White House, not only did they not get criminally prosecuted, many of them actually got checks written from the federal government for the wrongful harassment they suffered for simply policing that building that day. Meanwhile, people who took that unauthorized tour of the Capitol and had to be some of the most peaceful rioters in the history of rioting. These are people that literally stayed between the lines half the time as they're walking through the Capitol. These are people who didn't steal any art. The only thing that got taken was a now famously memed event. Someone who took the little pedestal and Pelosi's with him. There was a gentleman who put his feet up on Pelosi's desk. What's undisclosed is what came out at his trial. It was the media asking him to put his feet on Pelosi's desk. These are people who just came in, often directed to do there. There were people around, people like Mr. Epps. Apparently Rupert Murdoch doesn't want people talking about Mr. Epps because Tucker Carlson, the most popular TV news host in the modern age, had to resign yesterday or was separated from his employment for talking about what? According to the LA Times and the New York Times, for talking about Ray Epps. This was the very unusual case of the man who got a 60 Minutes profile while bragging in text to his kid about how he helped organize January 6th into an event that could lead to people being criminally prosecuted and punished, while he himself has never been criminally prosecuted and punished. He's not the only one. They have found in the Proud Boys trial, a friend of mine, colleague, Norm Pattis, is one of the defense lawyers, by the way, an old school Robert Kennedy-style Democratic liberal who's defending some of the Proud Boys, including Joe Biggs, in that trial, has found more evidence of government misconduct and malfeasance and misfeasance than in any case he's ever been a part of, and he's had the privilege of being a part of, unfortunately, too many in our legal system, going on decades of representation. You can recognize Norm as an old civil rights lefty because he still has a ponytail, like that's still popular.
Pause it real quick. And I do want to mention these January 6th defendants. A lot of these people were nonviolent and are still sitting in prison to this day, over 2 years after they haven't been given an expedient trial as they should have been under U.S. constitutional law. And now the fact that they are sitting in prison, this makes them political prisoners. They're going to sit there and rot until Donald Trump wins the election. And if he doesn't, God knows what's going to happen to him. A lot of these people should have been set free a long time ago. People have cut plea deals just to get out of prison because they won't give them a trial. It's absolutely insane what's going on with these January 6th prisoners. And I just had to mention that because I seen an interview the other day where people were saying these people committed violent crimes and they were properly prosecuted. The truth of the matter is a lot of them still haven't even been given a trial and have been left to rot in jail as political prisoners. Let's continue.
60s. In that case, what they found is they're now approaching over 100 informants, infiltrators, and instigators that day. People that were on the government payroll who were the ones directing people to go into the building, directing the people to confront the Capitol Police, directing people to try to take things once they were inside the building, directing people to be confrontational. And that is just one aspect of the degree to which January 6th was very much a Fedsurrection, not an insurrection. In other aspects, you can go into the QAnon movement and oddities about that movement in terms of who and what Q actually was. I remember a few months before the election saying that I had deep suspicions of the QAnon movement because it read and felt like an attempt to incorporate artificial intelligence into the ultimate informant, infiltrator, instigator kind of event. That for years, law enforcement has struggled to infiltrate various political groups to try to cause them to do counterproductive things. This is what, in fact, COINTELPRO was all about. That will take us back to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's program to infiltrate various civil rights organizations, anti-war organizations, other organizations associated with mostly the political left, but not always. They also went at the John Birch Society. They also went at various organizations on the right that were known for questioning and being skeptical of institutional narratives as to matters of war and other civil rights and civil liberties issues. That the goal was to be able to infiltrate them without requiring an individual do so. Is it really a coincidence that what we saw in Michigan involving the attempts to rescue Governor Whitmer's political career successfully ultimately by staging a fake kidnapping that was basically just some nerds hanging out in their basements that had no idea about anything, didn't know how to do anything, and it turns out that 2/3 of the people involved were all federal agents, that they were the ones who originated the idea, they were the ones who came up with it. When they got an honest trial, many of them were acquitted. The judge made sure they didn't get an honest trial the second time around. While some of the FBI agents involved in that case were ultimately found involved in getting into fights over swinger parties, to give you an idea for the moral values of that Federal Bureau of Investigation office, the person who helped run the fake kidnapping, fake insurrection Michigan effort had previously been tried to get the Michigan militia-aligned groups to stage such an event at the Michigan State Capitol during the COVID protest and the lockdown protest. Where do you think that person ended up a few weeks before January 6th? Ended up in Washington, D.C., and ended up being one of the lead FBI agents in charge of the January 6th cases. Is that a complete coincidence that the person who helped organize and orchestrate the Whitmer entrapment plot ends up being integral to the January 6th activities? The U.S. prosecutors and the media and federal judges, sadly, have all been complicit at trying to suppress this information, and despite their efforts, the Proud Boy defense lawyers have documented more and more and more of all the people on the federal payroll. And that doesn't even get to QAnon, which was trying to convince people leading up to January 6th that there were white hats in the FBI and in the Justice Department and in the intelligence operations and in the military that wanted them to take drastic action that day, that they were actually agents of the government if they went in and took dramatic action that day. Was that not also itself potentially part of a broader attempt by people within the FBI at the 7th floor level to get people to take counterproductive action, to discredit them and discredit the election challenge? I remember being there the day before, talking to Trump's lawyers, meeting with members of Congress, and I was curious. I was like, the National Guard was all over the place, by the way, but then would, at the request of the D.C. mayor and Speaker of the House Pelosi, disappear despite Trump's request on the day of January 6th. So the National Guard was not present, even though Trump had asked them to be there. Had they had the regular Capitol Police presence or the regular Guard presence that had been requested by the president, January 6th never happens, despite all the infiltrators, instigators, and informants' presence and attempts to provoke. Ray Epps is there the day before trying to provoke people, and people are spotting him for the provocateur that he is. But I was curious, how did Mitch McConnell, how did Nancy Pelosi have such confidence that there was going to be no meaningful vote, no meaningful debate on the electoral contest challenge, given the constitutional history that supported it? Senator Cruz.
This alternate slate of electors Trump was proposing, they keep saying it's illegal, it's illegal, it's illegal, but it has a history of alternate slate of electors being put forth. It's not the first time this has happened. People try to say this is the first time it happened. It's not. Donald Trump's lawyers were able to come up with this idea because it had happened previous times, I believe 2 times in the past. So this year, if the election is at or even a little bit close, I believe the Democrats will use an alternate slate of electors. Even if it's not close, they may try to use an alternate slate of electors. The issue they're going to have is after this incident, legislation went through Congress to make it illegal to offer up an alternate slate of electors. I believe they may still try to do it. We'll have to see. Let's continue. How much time's left? 2 minutes.
Senator Paul and others were getting together in an effort to create an 1886 style commission, 1876 style commission to look at what happened in Georgia, what happened in Arizona, what happened in Nevada, what happened in Wisconsin, what happened in Michigan, what happened in Pennsylvania, which was, as the Wisconsin Supreme Court would later confirm, a lot of illegal ballots were included in the presidential count that should not have been. And there were people who voted who weren't constitutionally qualified to vote. There were people whose votes were cast in a manner that wasn't constitutionally qualified, and the vote was counted and canvassed in a way that wasn't constitutionally qualified, because the Constitution requires that the rules be established by the legislature of the state, not by secret court orders, not by behind-the-scenes executive officials, not by Mark Elias cutting a deal with some corrupt person, not Zuckerberg buying off a local election office, none of that. All of those were legitimate issues, and yet they were incredibly confident that somehow they were never going to really see the light of day, that they were going to be demonized in some way. And Matt, is it really a coincidence that then January 6th develops the way that it does? Now that we know about the informants and infiltrators and instigators, why did the FBI and the Justice Department suddenly lose all interest in who and what QAnon really was, what Q really was? There was an obsession about it leading up to the election, and all of a sudden a complete lack of interest, as if they didn't want the world to dig deeper and to see what might be behind that.
Okay, that's very interesting. It's just an alternative evidence and theories of what happened on January 6th and what really happened with the election. There was a lot of things as put forth by Time Magazine itself in a very lengthy article that even if it wasn't directly stolen, there was these drop boxes, there were alternate places where you were able to vote, which were not legal, that were funded by Zuckerberg, things like this. This is what people were upset about, and they're not being allowed to voice their opinion about the corruption in the election itself. Thousands of dead people were placed on ballots and their votes were counted. Things like this or why people were upset. And when people are not allowed to voice their opinion, it can get violent, especially if you have this idea of government entrapment. They have a long history when it comes to especially racial or black movements, such as with Martin Luther King or with Malcolm X, of infiltrating those movements and trying to cause violence within those movements to derail the movement itself. And this is why I'm always against violence. If you have to resort to violence, you lost, because in the long term you are going to lose. And it's lucky January 6th stayed so within the lines that it did, that it's being real hard to blow out of proportion now. Also, whatever happened to those pipe bombs? There was multiple pipe bombs that were placed around. They caught the people on camera that placed those bombs, and nothing else was ever made of it. Could this have been the government itself placing bombs? Who knows? But I guess that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. I know it was a little bit of a more of an educational stream with the Robert Barnes January 6th election interference and less topical news. So I'll be back later tonight, and it will focus on the news of the day. It's me and Nat tonight at 4 p.m. West Coast time, 7 p.m. on the East Coast. Adios.